July 22nd on a hot day, and what you're seeing there is going to be the subject of today's program. That's a young Stonewall Jackson that you see on the screen there. And I'm very pleased to have here with us today Jack Lentz.
Not so young Jack Lentz.
Not so young Jack Lentz. Now, Jack, welcome to the program. And before you start, I want to alert the audience that we're not going to be talking a lot about Jackson and his wartime exploits. Jack thought it'd be a great idea to talk a little bit about this man's life, and starting with when he was born, I guess, Jack, or whenever you feel like it.
Well, that's a good starting point.
Okay, get going.
Well, he was actually born in 1824, January 21, midnight. They can whether to put him January 20 or January 21. His father was a lawyer, not too successful businessman. In fact, they had inherited considerable property there in northwestern Virginia, what was then Virginia, now West Virginia, and he had lost it through deals and gambling, so their life was pretty slim. His father married a lovely lady, Judith Neal, and they had 4 children. The first, Elizabeth, was followed by Warren, and then came Thomas, whom we'll call Stonewall, and finally Laura Ann. Now, the progenitors of Stonewall are kind of interesting. His great-grandparents came here in 1748 and had a family of 8 children, and one of these children, Edward, in turn produced 15 children. You could call him a fecund family.
Yeah,
and Edmund,
15 children.
Yeah, Edmund was quite a successful businessman. He was a surveyor. He acquired land, had as much as 1,500 acres out there.
This was in Virginia?
In Virginia, yes. In the area of now Clarksburg, West Virginia. Yeah. But he was very successful at that and really started the little town of Jackson Mill, which was really a sawmill. But it was a growing community, so he did well, and his son was Jonathan, and Jonathan Jackson was the father of Stonewall Jackson.
Oh, yeah.
And so we've said...
Jack, let me interrupt. His great-grandparent, or else his grandparents, one or the other, actually had been convicted of crimes in England, and that's why they came.
That would be his great-grandparents.
That would be the great one,
his great-grandparents. Yeah. So they came here. They came from Ireland, although they were English, I believe.
Yeah.
Is the way the biography goes. So anyway, there he was, and at age 2, Stonewall, or Thomas, at age 2, saw the death of his father and his first sister, Elizabeth. They died of typhoid fever.
Yeah.
So it was pretty rough for his mother to take care, and also, I must go on with that, the day after his father died, his mother gave birth to the 4th child, that was Laura Ann.
Oh my.
So there she was, in a way penniless, with 3 children. She tried to make ends meet by sewing, teaching school, and also the family was good to her. The family, there were so many, as we could see from the number of children that had been born, they were all over the place, so they took care of her. But after a while, she met a lawyer from Clarksburg, and she married him. And he was, I don't think, too reputable a guy. Nothing really wrong with him, but he had about 8 children of his own. So he and Julia Jackson, Stonewall's mother, had a plan where they would send her 3 children to live with her relatives.
Oh, yeah.
It's kind of strange that you would do that if they had just lost their father, or not too long ago, and here they were being farmed out. So really you could say at age 10, Stonewall was an orphan.
Yeah.
His brother Warren was sent to a family in Ohio. His daughter, or his sister, Laura Ann, with whom he was very friendly and close and was his correspondent when he was at West Point and so forth, they were dispatched to an uncle, Cummins Jackson, who had carried on the Jackson Mill establishment. So there they lived, but then Laura, in turn, was sent on to Parkersburg to an aunt. So really, Stonewall was by himself.
Yeah.
And he flourished in this environment. He liked it. He was a good worker. He helped at the mills, chopping down trees at the sawmill. He performed all sorts of duties, and his uncle was good to him. He really wanted for nothing, but at the same time, he missed a family life, certainly a father. The Cummins was not, his Uncle Cummins was not the fatherly type. So as he grew up, as he developed there, he realized that this life there at Jackson Mill in northwestern Virginia was not giving him two things which in his later life became so important to him. One, education, and two, religion.
Oh, yeah.
Now his education in those days were
one schoolhouse, a little room.
Yes, and itinerant teachers who would drop in, and of course everything was timed to, would it fit in with the growing season and so forth and so on. So he was probably taught how to read and to write, but he realized that this was not his life, or he didn't want this to be his future life. He wanted education. So it so happened that when he was about 17, 18, he heard of a representative, Hayes, in the district, who had five openings for West Point. Well, this was very much appealing to him, so he applied, but of course, because of his lack of education, he failed to get that appointment. So he went back to work. He accepted it, and then his friend, who was a clerk in town by the name of Butcher, he was very bright, particularly at mathematics, so he got one of these slots at West Point. And Butcher arrived at West Point, and he took one look at the summer schedule of orientation, what was required of him, and he said, no thanks, and left without even telling the representative who had appointed him. So he came back and went through Jackson Mill and saw Thomas and said, why don't you apply again? So Thomas did, and he got the whole family working for him. He had established quite a reputation as a reputable guy. He was dependable, he was honest, and my goodness, he got a whole handful of letters of recommendation. He got on a train, and came to Washington and saw Representative Hayes and presented, first of all, he told her that Butcher had resigned his commission, but here he was applying for it, and here were his letters of recommendation. Hayes looked it over, it looked good to him, so he took him out, introduced him to Secretary of War, and he was accepted as a plebe at West Point, the class of 46.
46, yeah. Okay.
So he returned to Jackson Mill, said goodbye to his sister Laura Ann, and made his plans to arrive at West Point.
So he got there, and then he ended up not being a good student at the beginning, or not. He wasn't high in the class until what? He progressed.
He progressed.
Tell us a little bit about that.
It was very interesting the way he arrived, and this was told from the words of General Maury, who was one of the generals in the Confederate Army. Maury, as well as Pickett as well as A.P. Hill, all of whom were generals in the Confederate Army. They were standing there on the hill at West Point watching the ferry arrive, and here came this tall guy with big hands and big feet, homespun clothes, everything he owned in a saddlebag over his shoulder,
Nowadays
shoes.
we call him sort of a hayseed.
Yeah, what is this frontiersman
Right,
doing here
yeah.
at West Point? So when he but Maury said when they met him, they could see from the glint in his blue eyes that he was here to stay. Now these were gentlemen, these were Southern gentlemen, you know,
Yeah.
they were educated with all the perks of that.
Yeah.
And here was this fellow. Yes, as you say, he passed the physical test okay. His mathematics was not good.
Jack, let me interrupt you on that,
Yeah.
on the physical. That reminds me. Something I read is that Jackson had a fetish about he felt one arm was longer than the other.
Yes,
Is that true?
that's true. That was his feeling, but one arm was longer than the other.
Why did he just measure it and do
Well,
something?
I don't know, and he had peculiar things about arms. He was always raising his left arm because he said, why should the heart use the blood to pump
Yeah.
into a member of the body that was not of use?
This is actually true.
This is actually true.
Yeah, okay.
And he had other quirks, which we'll talk about a
Yeah,
little later.
okay.
So yeah, he did not test well. He was at the bottom of the group. With a group, they called them the Immortals. But over the course of the 4 years, he did progress. And how he did this, that he was determined to succeed. And he realized his shortcomings. He said, I'm terribly ignorant, but I have a lot of energy, and I don't think I'm stupid, so I'm going to succeed. So he would spend nights lying on the floor, put an extra coal in the grate to give him light and warmth, and he would lie there and study the lesson that had been given that day. And he would not progress until he had internalized that, until he understood exactly what that lesson was all about.
Yeah.
And this continued, even though he was falling behind in his attending the class, it didn't bother him. He wanted to know exactly what was going on.
Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah.
And it was.
And so he actually moved up in the
He
standing.
moved
in his-
up.
Where did he end up graduating? Roughly what?
Well, they
part of
said
it?
roughly, say 19 or so, in the top third of the
Yeah,
class.
he started.
And again, his contemporaries later said that had he been there another year, they were certain that he would have
Yeah.
been the top man in the class.
Yeah. What happened to him? When he graduated? Did he stay in then? What was his progression?
No,
then?
well, it was just about the time of the Mexican War, about
Oh, yeah.
1845. Texas had been independent for about 10 years, but they wanted to join the Union. Well, when the Mexicans heard of that, they wanted no part of that. They wanted this back. So they declared war. So here was a fresh first lieutenant who was available he was a superb artilleryman. Even he had practiced that skill at West Point. So he was dispatched to Mexico, and he really enjoyed his time in Mexico and won all sorts of laurels for the way he could shift his artillery around. And this was just a part of what he developed later as a military tactician.
Yeah.
So he liked, and he was particularly successful in the siege of Mexico City, which was the final battle of the war. He stayed on there. He liked the color. He liked the people.
Was he promoted while he was in?
No,
there?
he was still he was still a lieutenant. And there, of course, the war was over. And then what do you do as a lieutenant? There were military posts all around the country. He didn't want that, but promotions weren't very available. He was sent down to Florida. The Indian Wars there had ceased. He didn't like what he did down there. In fact, got into a kind of a fight with one of his fellow officers, so he decided he was going to leave the Army. So he also heard of this job at VMI, Virginia Military Institute, which was the West Point of the South. That there was an opening there for a professor.
And that was at Lexington at that
This was
time
at
also?
Lexington, Virginia. So he applied for that and he got it. And of course, even though he was a lieutenant in the U.S. Army, he was a major because all the professors at VMI were majors. Now, this didn't mean that he was a major in the U.S. Army, but he was a major at VMI.
Oh.
And his stipend was about $1,200 a year with a living, very nice residence where he lived. And he learned to love Lexington. Really, that was a turning point in his life. It was there he met his first wife, who was a very vivacious lady, Eleanor Bumpkin, I believe was her name. Her father was a Presbyterian minister who had been president of Washington College, now Washington and Lee, and they married. But even in that, it was kind of interesting. They were in love with each other, but she had a sister whom she was very fond of, and she just couldn't leave her, so they took the sister along on honeymoon with them.
Really?
Isn't that something?
Yeah, that is something. First time I've heard of that.
So within the year, a baby was born, and both mother and baby died in the birthing, so he was without a wife. So he spent the next 3 years before he met his second wife. He made a trip to Europe, and this was interesting. Here you had a fellow who was really a soldier who had experienced war. Now he was a professor who was interested in military tactics. So, of course, while he was in Europe, he had to see Waterloo. So he looked it over and studied it, and then he made the comment, he lost that war because Napoleon lost that war because he approached it on the wrong axis.
Oh, my.
He returned to Lexington and married the love of his life, really. Her name was Mary Ann, again the daughter of a Presbyterian minister, Dr. Morrison.
Yeah, that's rather interesting. That both marriages were to the daughters of a minister.
Of a minister,
Did that influence him then, as far as his religious? Tell us a little bit about that.
I think so. I think his religion. He always had this feeling of a sense of God. But it came to fruition really in Lexington under the influence of his two wives and his father-in-laws.
Yeah.
He became a devout Presbyterian, swallowing hook, like and sinker, the Calvinistic predestination. He was indeed predestined to go to heaven, to be. He tithed. He didn't smoke or drink. He prayed
I was going to ask
in the
you
morning.
about that. So he, even during his army days, he didn't smoke or drink.
No, smoke or drink. In fact, on his deathbed, when they were offering him something, he didn't even want it then. But
Really?
no, he was. And while at Lexington, he organized a prayer group or a study group for slaves. And this continued throughout the war. Even when he was fighting, he would write home and find out that how is the group going? Is it still meeting?
Really?
And so forth and so on. And of course it was. And he was shy at first as a single man. He would be invited to a party and he'd eat beforehand because he had a stomach problem. What did they call it? A dyspepsia. Did you ever hear of that term?
No.
I don't know what it is. I think I heard it from my grandparents, dyspepsia. But anyway, and he was very careful about what he ate. I guess there he learned to love fruit. So that gave rise to the picture of him in battle with a slice of lemon in his mouth.
Yeah, there was a story that I read that he said he always had lemons. Now,
Always had lemons.
Is that true also?
That's true, yeah.
Where in the world did he get lemons in those days?
Well, I don't know, but they were. I remember one
his position,
story.
he could
A crate of lemons were delivered to him so that he would have them. They were not his favorite fruit, actually. He liked strawberries better.
Really?
Lemons were what he had in his. And of course, at Lexington, he made friends. He loved that area. it was just almost heaven for him.
Yeah.
But then, of course, the John Brown incident in Harper's Ferry.
Jack, before you leave Lexington, let me ask you another thing.
Yeah.
Something I read that, and again, if this is true, I read that that he tended to memorize his lectures.
Absolutely.
And that when students came back in to ask him questions and so on, his response normally was just what he'd already memorized. Is that?
He was a lousy teacher, let's put it that way.
Oh, okay.
He was, and even the superintendent, he didn't use the word lousy, but he said he was not a good teacher. His students, one called him Devil Tom, another wanted to kill him because he was a martinet. As you say,
Isn't that interesting? Because later on he became a good leader.
he became a good leader, and even his students saw how earnest he was. As you say, if they would question, there was no question during his lecture. It was strictly lecture, no dialogue whatsoever.
Yeah.
It was simply what he had memorized, he was telling them, and they were to obey it and go out and do as he said.
Okay, yeah, go on. I interrupt you there.
Well,
I don't want to end your...
And he was a artillery tactics. That was one of his courses. He was very good at that. Philosophy, natural and experimental philosophy was a course he really liked. He got into that. And so life was very good, but as I say, John Brown, the governor of Virginia at that time, when John Brown was going to be hanged at Harper's Ferry, the governor thought it would be good for some of the cadets from VMI to be up there in the case of any uprising among the blacks up there. So he escorted them to Harper's Ferry, and he was able to see John Brown's death. I wondered, did he make peace with his maker? John Brown didn't want any minister with him at his hanging, but it was Jackson's concern was he at home with his maker, you know. So he returned, and then the students, of course, with Lincoln.
Jack, we're down to about 5 minutes, so I'm sorry I didn't get you going there.
Oh dear.
Yeah.
We are going on.
Yeah.
Anyway, he became, of course, let's skip over, the war broke out. He was a secessionist. He was also for slavery. And of course, we know of his title, Stonewall, at the First Battle of Bull Run. We also know that that was the start of the rebel yell, you know, that piercing, spine-chilling yell of the rebels.
Yeah.
And so he there with his 1,800 men saved the day. His colleague, General B, who gave him the name Stonewall, was retreating, and here was Stonewall holding the fort. Of course, at the end of that, Stonewall said, "It wasn't I, it was the Lord," and he raised his hand because he was always pointing, it was God's will what he was doing, you see.
Did he, Jack, did he try to force religion upon his troops? None of that. No. It was strictly he himself.
Strictly, yeah. For example, they would be playing cards, and he would go by and hand down on a sheet telling when the next prayer meeting was.
Oh, really?
Whether they would come to it or not was immaterial. Yeah. So this continued on. Let's skip to Fredericksburg. He saw this Burnside and his attempt to climb Mary's Hill, which was occupied by the Confederates. Jackson was there as long as A.P. Hill and Longstreet. They were the three division leaders there. And that's where Lee made his comment and looking at the slaughter. It's good we see this because we might tend to like it too much.
Oh, yeah.
The war. Yeah. So, and then after Fredericksburg, his final battle was the Battle of Chancellorsville. Yeah. Burnside had been replaced by Hooker, and Hooker was determined to do what Burnside had not done. So he, along the Rappahannock, dug in and prepared for an assault. Of course, Jackson was on the other side with Lee. Now, the odds were always 3-1. Lee had about 50,000 troops, whereas the Hooker had about 150,000. But Lee and Jackson made a plan in which Lee divided his army. 28,000 went with Jackson on a flank movement around through this area which is known as the wilderness, and marched all night. And can you imagine taking 28,000 men plus supply, equipment, and not being seen by Hooker's troops, and yet arriving at 5 p.m. in the afternoon when the Yankees or the Northerns were cooking dinner and utterly slaughtering them. And even then, Jackson wanted to continue fighting, and his aides said, no, we've got to go home. So they turned back, and of course, in the shades and the darkness of night, the pickets, the Confederate pickets, thought they were enemies, and they shot and killed several of the party, and of course wounded him, right arm and also the left arm and shoulder. So he was taken to a field hospital nearby, and his arm was amputated. And at that, Lee made the comment, Jackson lost his left arm, but I lost my right arm.
And go ahead, finish that sentence. And what?
And so he was recovering from that very nicely, but pneumonia took him, and that was the cause of his death. His wife and his daughter, whom he had not seen for a while, were there, and he recognized them on his deathbed.
Jack, we're going to show a film clip now, and then I want you to make some comments after we show the show the clip, and it's. I think the audience will find it interesting what you have to say. But, here we go.
Order A.P. Hill to prepare for battle. Tell Major Hawks to advance the commissary train. Let us cross the river and rest in the shade of the trees. The stars of night contain the glittering day and rain his glory down with sweeter grace upon the dark world's grand enchanted face, all loath to turn away. And so the day, about to yield his breath, utters the stars unto the listening night, to stand for burning fare-thee-wells of light, set on the verge of death. O hero life that lit us like the sun, O hero words that glittered like the stars, and stood and shone above the gloomy wars when the hero's life was done. The phantoms of a battle came to dwell in the fitful vision of his dying eyes. Yet even in battle dreams, he sends supplies to those he loves so well. His army stands in battle line arrayed, his couriers fly, all's done, now God decide. And not till then saw he the other side, or would accept the shade. Thou land, whose sun is gone, thy stars remain. Still shine the words that miniature his deeds. O thrice beloved, where'er thy great heart bleeds, solace hast thou for pain.
Thing about Jackson, I mean, he was a hero of the South and also of the world, you might say. Even the British, were thinking about supporting the South. Recognize the man, and he was compared to Oliver Cromwell, to Caesar, to Napoleon, and so forth and so on.
And to this day, Jack, he's quite famous.
Well, you had Norman Schwarzkopf of what? Battle Storm in Iraq. He said, where do you think my hook, my left flanking hook in Iraq came from? Chancellorsville and Jackson.
Okay, we're going to end it on that. Don't run away. Okay, folks.